We are back. We are back, and we are obviously talking about Superman, and we are talking about the Triangle era. But before we proceed, let me say we have a Patreon now. There's only one tier on it, so think of it as a tip jar. Just send me money. Seriously, just enough money to keep this Zoom account subscribed to. That would be great. Links in the comments below. We are talking about the Triangle era for Superman. So, the Triangle era, for those of you not in the know, is known because at the time there were 4 Superman books and they were interconnected. And to keep everything straight, they would put triangles on the cover of every book. And those triangles would have a number in it, which would tell you what point they were in the story. Because as you know, the different series had different numberings. Really, it was a way to keep it all organized. I am, of course, with Paul and Lamar. And let's start. Lamar, what do you remember about the Triangle era?
Well, it took me a while to figure out what exactly was going on with the triangle because, as I've told on here before, where I grew up at, we didn't have a comic book shop. I grew up in a small town, so we got our comics from, the gas station or the grocery store a lot of the times, unless, we went uptown and, they had comic book shops up there, but that was rare. So, and I couldn't figure it out because we would have like the Superman comics and we'd have action, right? But we didn't have adventures or the Man of Steel comics. So it took me a while to kind of figure out what was going on with the triangle thing. But once I had figured it out, I was like, oh, well, this is kind of cool. They got stuff running in between, the 4 books, and there's some stuff happening. So I thought that was cool. Because obviously, at that time I wanted to get all of them, right? Which I guess is kind of the point, right? So a lot sometimes I'd have to pick and choose, but usually, but the Superman and the action, I pretty much got those pretty much every time. And every now and again they would slip something in from Man of Steel and Adventures.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it was like there was some type of incentive with the grocery stores or whatever it was with that, because they were trying to drive the triangle thing, but they would get them every so often, I don't know, but I definitely remember I had to have the Superman and the action. I had to have them every month, and because it was just 2 different flavors, but they went good together, so yeah. But yeah, in that particular era, Superman was really fun, and they had a lot of different characters, and the characters were being put in different positions to keep everything interesting, because sometimes it's not always Superman, it's his supporting cast, because they really kind of hold up this era of Superman. You know what I mean? It's like it's all about the supporting cast. And I dug that.
I feel like that the supporting cast is super important when you have a weekly book like this, right? You can't just put it all on your main character. Paul, your impressions, your remembering of the Triangle era.
Well, I'm a bit like Lamar in that I didn't experience it as it was meant to be experienced by counting the triangles, because I got my Superman comics in the 90s via British reprints. There was this comic that was also called The Adventures of Superman, that reprinted all of the Triangle era comics, and then the newsagent would also have the American Superman comic in it. Didn't have action, didn't have adventure, didn't have Man of Steel, but it did have Superman in there as well. So I was sort of like piecing it together almost. And then, of course, I bought trade paperbacks as well. So it's very much jigsawing the Triangle era together. But it was so much fun because it was this ongoing storyline following these characters, and I'm seeing their life out of order in this weird way and piecing it together, which is quite fun. And like Lamar was saying, you know, you've got like this vast supporting cast, which you could only have because it was essentially this weekly book. And I remember the British reprint of The Adventures of Superman advertised, the tagline at the top was superhero and soap opera action, and that's what it was.
That's what it
the
was. Yeah,
Triangle
that's
Era
what it was.
you know? And that's never really, they've never really gotten back to that, you know? It was a great era, just following these people and following their lives, or in my case, piecing together their lives from at different points, you know? But I
Yeah,
loved it.
no, I get it because I was like, look, DC was not cool in school. I told you guys this before in various videos. So I was not collecting DC comics at the time. But because Superman has always spoken to me, so I was always kind of buying a Superman comic at some point in time. But I didn't realize what they were doing with the triangles until the Death and Return, which is not covered in this first omnibus that they're putting out. The first omnibus collects Superman 49 to 64, Adventures of Superman 472 to 486, Action Comics 659 to 673, and the first 8 issues of Superman Man of Steel. So they were actually already doing the weekly interconnected thing before actually putting the triangles on it. We have fond memories of the stuff that's come before, so really quickly tell me when they started doing the weekly thing, what is your favorite pre-triangle story? Or give me a few moments that you remember, Paul.
Well, so before the triangles officially came on, it's Exile, you know? It's basically the triangle era really started as soon as John Byrne went, in my view. That's when they really started telling these kind of these long form kind of soap opera stories. And an Exile where Superman was really traumatized from John Byrne's run and exiled himself into space. And it was a really, because it was such a great story, because you got to see what Superman was up to in the depths of space, but you got to see what everyone else was up to back in Metropolis while he was gone. And again, you know, that kind of weekly format, you could tell that kind of story with that. So that was my favorite thing that happened before the triangles officially came into place, I think.
I will say Exile, where Superman is out in space because he had killed 3 Phantom Zone criminals from a pocket universe, is one of my favorite Superman stories. And just to show how impressionable I was, I'm a city boy. There is an issue of Action Comics that was written by Roger Stern and drawn by Cary Gamble, who would have been one of the greatest artists who ever lived in this medium if he had decided to just stay on comics for a longer period of time, which he didn't. That where Superman finds an abandoned planet and decides to farm it. And it made young me think, I would like to learn how to farm.
That's a great issue. That's fantastic.
And because that only happens because it's well told, right?
Yeah.
But what I think my favorite one is, it might not actually be Exile. I think my favorite is The Day of the Krypton Man.
Yes. Yeah.
Where Superman's mind is taken over by the Eradicator, and he believes that he's going to now be this pure Kryptonian being and is now cold towards everyone until his parents talk him out of it. It also has Maxima, Princess of Almerac, in some of the raciest Superman comics you'll ever see, which is really funny. By the way, I'm going to go ahead and say it. If Maxima debuts now, Tumblr is all over that character.
Oh, no question. No question.
Absolutely.
Lamar, your favorite pre-official triangle story?
Oh, man. You know, like you already said, like the Krypton Man. And Paulie said Exile. But a lot of the stuff that I liked it was, you know, it was there was a period of time, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about. There was a period of time like with, and I'm just going to keep it to the action stuff, the action comic stuff, like where George Perez and Kerry Gamble were doing a lot of these covers, right? Those covers, if you just run through them and just look at the covers, you're like, man, this is absolutely nuts. Some of the greatest Superman covers are in that stretch right before you get to the Triangle era officially. And there's just some mind-blowing stuff in there. And I couldn't wait to read none of that stuff. Like, you know, as we're talking, I'm kind of just going through them.
Through the covers.
And
Yeah.
and this is like after John Byrne, you know, because there was a time where action was coming out every week, and that was like right before this. And there's some great covers in there too, but yeah, some of this stuff, like because this is all after like the Action 600, you know, issue and all of that.
Yeah.
And you get these you know, like when Maxima shows up, I think it's Action
a little
645.
Yeah, it's a little before
Yeah.
Krypton Man.
Yeah. So yeah, just that string of covers, starting with like 600, and then you run through like 644 is where you have the Superman by George Perez, and he's wearing like the black and gray version of his costume.
Yeah.
You know, like, and with his eyes are glowing up. That's crazy. Like, you know, to me, that had me wide open. And the Brainiac stuff that comes right before the Maxima stuff, man, it's like,
Yes.
yeah, that stuff was wild,
Yes.
man. And
Yeah.
it was just like one thing after another. And I'm like a single issue guy. Like I still am. Like I like comics that end in a single issue, but they're starting to do like these part 2 and part 3 things. Like the Brainiac thing, I think was like 3 parts.
Yeah.
And it's just some of the stuff that they were doing. Kerry Gamble, that this is one of my favorites, the 654 with Batman makes an appearance. This is like
Dark Knight over Metropolis.
there you go. That's
Yeah.
the one. Yep. Yeah. I mean, some of this stuff is just crazy work, man. It's just crazy work. And yeah, so that whole era, like where we're coming out of the John Byrne weekly action stuff and into the Triangle stuff, all of that stuff is great, man, for a bunch of different reasons. But yeah, you can't go wrong with none of that stuff, because it all kind of feels like one thing to me, right? Even though the stories are all different, it all just kind of feels like one thing, you know?
No, I know what you mean. Let me
Yeah.
tell you something else about Kerry Gamble. You know, George Perez, John Byrne, Dan Jurgens, Butch Geese, Tom Grummett, all those guys, great artists, drew a lot of iconic images. But if I told you that the most iconic Superman pose of that era came from Kerry Gamble, one, you might argue with me, but you would see my point. And two, you know exactly the image I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not arguing with you about it. Yeah, I definitely ain't arguing. Yeah, and I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, that was a great time. I'm going to go ahead and also say a little bit of a shout out to the pre-official Triangle era for introducing me and my young mind to a great character named Terra Man, who I bought that comic off the shelf. It is Superman number 46, which is an amazing cover.
Yes.
By Jerry Ordway, showing, you know, it emulates a Wild West showdown. And it also introduced me to Jade and Obsidian, who, as you know, as you both know, are Alan Scott's kids. And I grew up and I ended up being a big Justice Society fan. So props to the Triangle era for that.
Oh, another thing too, since you brought that up, you know, the stuff that Jerry Ordway was doing, you know, he was doing the pencils, the inks, and the covers the colors for a lot of that stuff he was doing.
And
And
he was
got some
writing
real
his
good
own
work.
stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
he was
yeah.
writing his
So
own
he
stuff.
he was a one-man gang, and he put in some work on this.
Let's talk
Yeah.
about Dark Knight over Metropolis. Well, what did you guys think of that one?
Well, I love how that storyline is like ends a storyline that John Byrne started, years before this. In that there's a really famous story in Superman #2, I think,
Yes.
By John Byrne, where Lex Luthor hires a scientist to find out information on Superman, specifically what is Superman's connection with Clark Kent. And this scientist creates a computer which figures out the secret. Clark Kent is Superman. And Lex Luthor doesn't believe it, because he doesn't believe that someone with Superman's power would want to be ordinary. So he fires this scientist. Now, I wish I could remember the character's name. She's a great character. And obviously, he's been treating her really badly up until then as well, because he's Lex Luthor.
He's Lex Luthor, yeah.
And so
Amanda
she's
McCoy.
Amanda McCoy, yeah. So Amanda McCoy's kind of been in the background all through Exile, the Exile storyline. Just sort of like, she knows Clark Kent is Superman, and she wants to prove it, to sort of vindicate herself. She doesn't want to reveal it to the world. She just wants to know for herself, so she knows she was right. So she hires a private investigator, and in Dark Knight over Metropolis, she's just killed by a random mugger.
Yes.
Just before Dark Knight over Metropolis. And then that storyline then is Batman and Superman trying to find out who this woman is. And it's just, it's really sad that she was killed. But again, you're invested in this character, so her death has some meaning, because you've been following her for literal years at this point.
Yeah.
And so it really packs a punch, and you're invested in Superman and Batman's investigation. So it's a great story.
Once again, this omnibus that is coming out on September 17th kicks off with a storyline called Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite, which is an official team up between Lex Luthor and Mr. Mxyzptlk. Words I never thought I would actually say in real life. And Mxyzptlk also creates Red Kryptonite, which at this point in time didn't exist in the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths continuity.
Right.
And it removes Superman's powers. You guys have any fond memories of this particular story that kicks us off?
I love this story. It's great seeing Superman without his powers, and that he has to lean on his friends basically to help him, like Professor Happerson, who again is another character we've been following since just after John Byrne's run. And he makes a little suit for himself, doesn't he? Like a power suit. And you even see him sort of like with a sort of grappling rope and all this. So it's great to see like how he deals with not having powers in this sort of post-crisis context, because of course we've seen him without powers loads of times before.
Yes.
But we've not seen this version of Superman without powers, I think, for this length of period until this story. And I really love stories like this that show Superman can function without his powers, because of course in Superman 2, which I'm not knocking this because it works in the context of the film Superman 2, but he loses his powers there and just gets the crap beaten out of him by some random trucker, So, and he's completely useless and acknowledges that he's useless without his powers. So it works in the context of that film, but I hate the idea that people go away thinking, oh, Superman's useless without his powers. So it's great in Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite seeing Superman, still functioning and still being relevant without his powers.
Just to speak touch on that, right? Superman is the only character that people say if you take away his powers, he's useless. But like, you could literally make that argument at its base for any superhero that has powers or any villain that has powers, right? So it's like, this is kind of like the way they do what they do. So why are you singling out Superman for possibly being useless when you could literally do that to any of these people? You know, like it's just a really strange argument to make. But Superman has no shortage of stories like that, right? He's got a lot of them,
Oh
and
yeah.
they all kind of touch on the same thing. It's like, you know, his powers aren't really what makes him who they are, who he is, right?
Yes.
And the biggest thing about him that makes him a hero has nothing to do with him lifting anything or flying anywhere. It's just, you know, character and fortitude, you know, and stuff like that. And a lot of these ideas that we have of Superman in a lot of ways actually come from this period. It's like it's interesting because they expanded the Superman mythos in a lot of different ways, and you even got to have like fun stories like you were talking about Luthor fighting a fifth dimensional imp. Like how is that supposed to work, right? But he does it, you know. So there's no shortage of like actual stuff to read if you don't want to read like the beat 'em up Superman, you know. Like and that's kind of what makes this thing great is you know, those stories like that. There's a story I can't remember if it's Adventures of Superman, but there's a story where it's like Superman and Guy Gardner and Hal Jordan, who has like the
Yeah.
5 o'clock shadow and everything. And it's just like the cover is wild, right? It was Art Thibault and was it Jerry Ordway?
Is it Dan Jurgens?
Dan Jurgens, right. Yeah. I don't know why I said Jerry Ordway. Yeah, but him and Art Thibault have a lot of stuff from this era. But yeah, it's just like you have all in one place with these 4 books. You have all of these different explorations happening at the same time about the type of story potential Superman has as a character. It's really, really hard for me to say I have a favorite because of that, because I just loved all of it, you know. Even the stuff that didn't work, I at least thought it was funny, you know. So I mean, I even the stuff that like I was just like, yeah, I probably wouldn't rock with that today, you know, I still get a tickle out of it because it's just ridiculous. You know what I mean? So even it's worthwhile to me because of that. You know, it's not something that makes me angry or anything. But yeah, this whole Triangle era, man, was a wild ride, man. Just yeah.
Well, Crisis of Crimson Kryptonite is a perfect example of what you were saying, you know, because he hasn't got his powers. But
Yeah.
like you said, you've got Luthor and Mrs. Pitlick. You've got Clark and Lois getting engaged. You've got Luthor dying, you know, the death of Lex Luthor.
It is the one where Clark and Lois get engaged. That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've got Starman, if that floats your boat.
I was gonna say that's what I was gonna bring up about Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite is that Roger Stern managed, because Roger Stern at the time created with the late Tom Lyle a new character called Starman, who is not the cool one.
Oh yeah, this is a totally different guy. Yeah.
I love Will Payton. He is not the cool Starman. So Will Payton was created, and then somehow Roger Stern who was writing both books, decided, you know what? Superman gets his powers from the sun. Who can give him enough solar energy to restore his powers? I know. The guy I just made up. That's amazing. Okay? Yeah. Because for you guys who weren't there just a few years before over at Marvel, Roger Stern handled a character named Monica Rambeau. And when Monica Rambeau was in the Avengers, every time Monica Rambeau was not on the screen, what would the other character say, Paul?
Where's Monica Rambeau?
Don't we need Monica Rambeau right now? And that's what he did with Starman. You know what? Not complaining.
Not complaining. No.
This story, like you were saying, Lois's mom has cancer at this point, and so Clark ends up proposing to her. It takes a while to answer, but this omnibus begins with Clark and Lois getting engaged, which is a huge thing at the time. Because we're not even like many years away from the reboot at this point. They're moving really fast, right?
Yeah.
Now Clark and Lois are engaged.
But like the beauty of the Triangle era and this era of Superman comics is that they were making these huge changes to Superman's status quo. And sure, you know, they were big at the time, but it wasn't like today when they make huge changes, like, you know, like New 52 or whatever, because with the Triangle era, you could build up to this stuff. So it was like, well, of course they're getting engaged because they've earned it. You know, you've earned this storyline because you've been building up to it for so long. You know, you've earned the death of Lex Luthor in this story because we've been following him, realizing that his kryptonite ring has given him cancer and he's already lost his hand. And we've been following this for so long. They earn these big storylines. So, and this is why they end up being enduring changes in the case of Clark and Lois getting engaged and married. You know, that's still around today because they earned it and it feels natural and it feels like it should be part of the status quo. So it becomes part of the status quo.
This is a great segue into the next big plot point that happens, which is that Lex Luthor dies.
He's got he goes out like a champ, doesn't he?
Yeah, he do. Yeah, he do.
What does he do? He steals his own jet. It ejects the
At this
pilot
point,
out.
we should remind the wait, hold on. Before we go on, in Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite, it is a very rare Superman Fantastic Four crossover. Read the Omnibus. Mr. Mixes-Pitalik might show up in other places, is what I'm saying.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
You know, John Byrne drew that sequence.
Oh yeah, that makes sense actually. Yeah.
Yeah, he came back. He came back for that sequence.
Of course he would.
But yes, back to the death of Lex Luthor. At this point, we should remind readers that due to wearing a kryptonite ring, the same ring that was eventually found by Batman and kept by Batman, Lex Luthor lost his hand. And it was the radiation was slowly killing him. And then he, again, goes up like a champ. I mean, you know, I don't know how many people read the original comic and actually believed he died.
Oh yeah.
But obviously, no body was found.
Yeah, and he deliberately crashes his own plane, and Superman finds his twisted remains. So, you know, as far as the reader is concerned, it's like, how has he got out of this one? You know, because you know he's not dead, but there is a body, which is quite unusual.
Yes, and also the thing about Lex is that at this point in time, he's such an omnipresent character. He's a big bad throughout the entire run of Superman at this point. And here they are saying, you know what, he's just not going to show up for a while.
But weirdly, he's still a character because he, like you say, he's such a powerful presence that his absence is a character in a way, is a plot line.
It's always there. Yes.
Yeah, and what you'll see in this omnibus is that you'll have people talk like, where's his will? You know, who's running his company now? What are we going to do about it? You know, it's yeah.
Oh my
character.
God, he has a son?
Yes.
Lamar, what did you think of this whole Luthor dying thing?
You know, it was funny because the way they handled him having the kryptonite ring and everything, right? It was like an obvious like subplot, but you could see that it was stretched out because like he would just be in the middle of yelling at somebody and berating them, and then, you know, just out of nowhere he would just go, I like that, and then they would be like, well, what's going on? And he'd be like, nothing, get out, you're fired, you know. So but it's not like they just kind of like dedicated a book to it or anything, right? You know, so it was just something that was happening in the background, like in between stuff. And so but also it was never established before this reboot, the post-crisis reboot, was it ever established that kryptonite was, I mean, obviously it's a, you know, it's a radiated object, but it was never established before that it actually could kill people that weren't Kryptonian, was it?
I don't believe so. No.
Before Crisis.
Yeah. Well, like the post-crisis, I don't think that like during the crisis or like the pre-crisis period that they had established that.
No, pre-crisis it was nothing. Post-crisis, Lex started wearing the ring, and then they made it a thing that
they made it a thing.
It would slowly, but you had to be like in close contact with it for an extended period of time.
So and and see, that's the thing too. That was something that was new. Yeah, and that's the point I was making. And instead of making like this huge big deal out of it, they just had Lex doing whatever it was he was doing. And you just kind of figure like, well, Lex is a smart guy. He could handle that and be good to go, And when and then the next thing he ends up losing his hand. And, and then, it just kind of progresses from there to him actually, doing the other wild stuff he did to fake his death or whatever. And I don't know, like Paulie said, when you're reading it, this is going somewhere, and it's like, yeah, I mean, he's not dead, man. Come on now. This is, we know this. Lex is too evil and nasty to like die, and Superman is still on the table, right? So, we know that. So, but it was just from that point, when Superman finds the body, I was like, I don't care what y'all say. I'm just trying to wait and see how this dude come back, or like what happens. Like, because I'm in it for that at this point. It's not so much that, and I'm enjoying, like Paulie said, like his presence, the lack of presence. It's like you're just waiting for him to pop up in the next panel some kind of way, So until he actually comes back, that was the feeling I had. Like, how are they going to do it? When's it going to happen? A lot of the things that led up to his death were like in the background, or like they were segues into other stuff. So when he comes back, is it going to be like a big deal? Are they going to do it the same way? So I was intrigued by that. Like, how are they going to handle this? So, and that kind of was like the driving force for me. Like, I'm like invested in this. Not necessarily to the point that I'm rooting for him, because sometimes, a villain will make it be like, man, this dude is just so fly with it. Like, I like him. You know what I mean? So, but like, so I wasn't quite there with it, but I just was like, okay, I got to see how he does this. Right. Because, he, like you said, he stole his own plane. He developed the skills to crash a plane, like, because, you see people doing that all the time in comics. They are professional plane crashers. Like, that's like a thing in comics. Right. And you can make it look like it was an accident, but it's really not. You just have somebody who's skilled enough to crash a plane and not die. So now, so it's just like all of these other elements that are in it, and I'm invested in the whole thing. So now I'm just like, okay, when he finally comes back, what's going to happen, right? And that was like my whole thing. That was one of the things to keep reading, because I was like, I don't want to miss it, And as a comic book fan, that's the way I like to be. You know what I mean? Like, you understand what I'm saying? I like to be there. Like, and I think
looking forward to the next issue. Yeah.
And see, because like I said, I'm a single issue dude. So, when the single issue's over, they're going to have something. They're going to give you the cliffhanger, and then it goes into the next thing. So yeah, we talking about a cliffhanger that took a while, right? But it's worth it because it's Lex Luthor. It's not just like some throwaway guy,
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah. So that's where I was with it the whole time. Like, I want to go back and read it right now, man.
So the funny thing to me about Lex Luthor's death is that people always talk about the revolving door, right? When it comes to character deaths. I don't think anyone made a big deal out of this. And I think the reason for that is because they executed it in such a way that everybody knew he was not dead.
Right. Yeah.
And they were just waiting for him to come back. Yeah. The other thing that I'm wondering is does the complaint about the revolving door only apply to heroes? I don't think I've ever heard anyone complain about a bad guy coming back from the dead.
Yeah, I mean, the Joker, that's his thing, right? He falls down an hole at the end of the adventure, and then he's somehow back next time. That's just what he does, right?
Yeah. He's fallen into the river like more times than any other character ever.
Yeah, and that was baked in right from the start, you know, like those early 1940 issues of Batman, where
Oh yeah,
Joker first
yeah.
turns up. He's falling down, then he gets stabbed or something in his second appearance. He gets
Mhm.
stabbed, you know. So
Yeah, yeah.
So that part is interesting, but let's move on
yeah,
to the next big thing that happens in the development of this iteration of Superman is that he decides to come clean and tell Lois Lane that he, Clark Kent, is Superman because he decides he cannot marry this woman unless he's completely honest with her. I'm going to ask you two questions. One is, what did you think of the way this was handled? The other thing that I wanted to ask you is, it bugs me a little bit that Lois didn't figure it out herself. But I also understand that it is thematically correct that Clark has to be honest with her. So I'm not exactly sure where I stand on that creative choice. Does it, is it something that you guys consider at all? So what do you guys think? And what do you guys think of that second question?
well, I really like how they did it, and I think it's very important that it's Clark telling her and not Clark being found out, and there's a line they had to straddle, I think, which I think they did quite well, you know, with Lois kind of saying, I guess I knew all along, you know, but didn't want to admit it
A little
because you
bit
don't
of a
want it to seem like,
straddling line, yes. It's a little
yeah,
bit of a cop out.
it's a bit of a cop out, but I think it's a necessary cop out, you know, but I think they straddle that line really well. And they do it in Superman 2 as well, or at least in the Richard Lester version of Superman 2, because Superman trips on a bearskin rug, doesn't he, or whatever, and lands in a fire. And he's like, I don't know why I did that. And Lois is like, well, maybe you wanted me to know. So again, it's like he basically tells her in that version of it, and it has to be that. I think it has to be Clark Kent choosing to be honest with this woman after basically lying to her for so long. You know.
In the new
Um,
cartoon, My Adventures with Superman, she finds out.
yeah, that's true. Actually, yeah. So that kind of undermines everything I just said because they
No,
do that
but
really
but
well as well.
the way that they get around that is that she finds out as he was about to tell her anyway.
That's true. Yeah. So again, straddling that line, like, yeah, yeah. And I
I,
think
I just feel both
you've
those
got to
things are
do that.
important.
What's that say?
I feel like both those things are important. So I don't
Both of
really
those
know
things
what
are
I
important.
prefer. Where do you
But
stand on this, Lamar? Yeah, go on,
yeah.
go on, Paul, you first.
Oh yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Paulie. I'll come after you.
Well, I was just going to say, I think they've done it well. I think it is straddling the line is the way to do it well, because you don't want Lois to look like a dope, but you don't want Clark to look like a liar. So if you can straddle that line where they don't look like either of those things, you've done it well. And I think in this occasion, in the Triangle era, they do it well. In My Adventures of Superman, they do it well, and I think in Richard Lester's Superman 2, they kind of do it well as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, Lamar.
No. You good. I think that in this case, this is one of the things that we can say about John Byrne's Superman that he got right is his treatment of Lois,
Absolutely.
especially with the Superman thing, because one of the things that he established for people who haven't read it is that Clark is like, I could probably just like be Superman, and she has this thing for Superman, and then I could just tell her I'm Superman now and she'll just love me forever and we'll be great. But I wouldn't be honest doing that. So what I got to do is I have to earn her as Clark, right? Because and that's important because he kind of established that Superman is just kind of what he does, right? But Clark is like the person that he is, and I think that's an important dynamic too, that he's not pretending to be Clark, but throughout all of this other stuff that was going on up to this point, he actually does that. And so now he's like, okay, now that we've established this, I want to marry her and stuff, but I can't do it with without letting her know who I am. And so now you're at this point where it's like, okay, if you don't do this right, you undermine the Clark stuff and you undermine the Lois stuff, right? So this is something you absolutely got to nail the landing on. And so obviously, you know, you can't just have it where Clark's like, hey, you know, I'm Superman and I want to tell you a long time, but you know, and then she's just like, oh my God, you know, or whatever. And then you can't have it where he does that and she's like, man, I knew you were Superman like the second or third time I met you. Like, you know, I just kind of let you play this along because I just want to know what was going to take you so long, right? Because that kind of undermines that part of it where, you know, he's like, you know, I have to, you know, I'm really Clark, so if I'm going to be with her, I have to be with her in that way. It undermines all of that, right? So then it just gets to the point where it's like, how do you do it, you know? And so they both kind of have their moment where when you're reading it, it's actually in a lot of ways it's gratifying from a narrative perspective because, you know, especially in the Lois case, because she didn't get thrown under the bus, right? And so like for a lot of her history, especially coming out of the pre-crisis period, you know, and the Silver Age and all of that, she was just kind of treated like fodder and less like a character. So in a lot of ways, she was treated like a plot device. And I do think that this particular era of Lois is what you really get a good idea about the kind of character she is. Because Lois is one of the greatest comic book characters ever, as far as I'm concerned, you know. And like if you were to tell me she was the greatest comic book character ever, I wouldn't argue with you, you know. And this whole thing that's happening in the Triangle thing is part of the reason why that's the case. And I guess if you have to do it that way, this is probably one of the better ways to do it, you know. And there's probably a few other ways it could have gone, but I mean, you know, yeah, this is one of them, like probably say you got to settle in the middle, you know, because if you go lean too far to one way or the other, it doesn't work.
And what you were saying there, Lamar, about how Byrne established that Clark was the real person, this was the best era to do this story in.
Yeah.
Because Lois was falling in love with the real Clark.
Yeah.
You know, so it really lessened the deception on Clark's part, you know? Like to the point where in Superman's Secret Origin, which is a much later story, and Jeff Johns and Gary Frank are depicting Clark as the dork again, Clark as the disguise, you know, which is an equally valid take, which I enjoy. But they had to sort of pay lip service to the fact that Clark and Lois are eventually going to get married. And like, why would Lois be attracted to this dork, you know? And so you've got Lois in Secret Origins saying lines like, oh, there's a depth to you that not anyone else can see, but I can see it. There's something more going on there, you know? And you've got to contrive this way for her to be attracted to Clark, even though he's deliberately being unattractive. But so it would have been a lot harder to do the engagement for the first time in that era. And it would have been a lot harder to do it before the crisis. So the Triangle era, where you've got the Clark as the real person, is the perfect time to do this story. And I'm glad they did.
The Triangle era is the perfect time to do all of these interpersonal things because, like we mentioned earlier, it's the most soap operatic of all the eras because it has a whole cast of characters and you are invested in all of these characters. I'm invested in the fact that Lex Luthor is actually Jerry White's dad. I'm invested in the fact that to get over it, to work past this conflict in their marriage, Perry White and Alice White decide to go on a cruise where they meet Ma and Pa Kent. Right? Like, I'm invested in the fact that Jimmy Olsen has no job at this point in time and just keeps taking all sorts of various jobs. All of this stuff is just fun.
What Jimmy's up to, like Jimmy is so well served by the Triangle era because he's just ticking away in the background, living his life. And it's his own life. It's nothing. It's obviously in sex with Superman, but he loses his job not because of Superman. He just loses it because the economy's bad, you know. And okay, all his hair falls out because of Superman, but you know how he deals with that then is ticking over in the background. He gets involved with Project Cadmus through that and has adventures in his own right. And yeah, it's just he's not just Superman's pal; he's his own dude.
You could
that you're
take
following.
you could take all of the Jimmy scenes, and it would still make sense. It would still make
Absolutely.
sense.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, definitely.
And with that, because because the reason I brought up all of those different dynamics throughout this particular run is because I wanted to talk about this amazing multi-part story that crosses over in the 3 books. At this point, there is no Man of Steel yet. That crosses over into the 3 books, and this story is called Time and Time Again. So, what happens in Time and Time Again? Superman gets shunted around in various time periods, but only hours are passing in the present. So in every single issue, we check in on every single supporting cast member and what they're up to, moment by moment. So Superman's having all of these adventures. Meanwhile, in one issue, Lois is thinking something, and then in the next issue, she's thinking the next thought after that thing, despite the fact that Superman at this point has had like a whole adventure in another time altogether. What Time and Time Again? Talk to me.
It's going to be the highlight of this omnibus for me. I love Time and Time Again. It's got everything, like it's got the Legion in it. I love the Legion. Loads of different versions of the Legion as well. It's got dinosaurs in it, you know.
Got dinosaurs.
It's got like 1940 Superman meeting FDR and being a strong man in a circus. Awesome. And it's got Booster Gold in it as well. Yeah, so you've got that going on, and as you say, all the while this is going on, you're seeing Lois coming to the terms with the fact that she's engaged with Superman, but she has to do this without Clark there because he's off having adventures in time. You've got like the board of Lex Luthor's company arguing over what they're going to do now that Lex Luthor is dead. You've got Ma and Pa Kent meeting the Whites on a cruise. No, that's not in that
That's
story,
not it.
is
That's
it?
not it. No, that's not
you've
it.
just got Perry and his wife coming to terms with their son's death, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is also lovely. And you've got the introduction of the Linear Men. I love the Linear Men, who are basically, for those who've not encountered the Linear Men before, Dan Jurgens created them, and they're just time cops, you know?
The
Great
Time
concept.
Police.
Yeah, they're like the Marvel guys in Loki.
The Time
what are they
Variance
called?
Authority.
Yeah, they're basically DC's version of the TVA, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're great. They're better than the TVA.
You know, with this story, well, first thing that has me all the way in on this, number one, Superman encounters the Legion of Superheroes.
Yes.
Does 3 times in the story. And then the other thing that happens is he encounters the JSA, well, almost, right? So if the JSA and the Legion of Superheroes is in it, I'm there, right? So, but yeah, what Paulie was saying about the Linear Man is like, it's like, if you're talking about a character that like deals with this sort of like time travel stuff, like the Linear Man does it in kind of a cool way. Like there's a part where like this bomb's about to blow up or whatever, and then they stop the clock on the bomb, and then he just starts it back up again because he's like, nah, we need this to happen. So he just starts it back up. It's like so it's like all of this wild stuff happening, but it's like, but it's fun. The whole story is fun. I think that actually is in a it's in trade by itself, right?
Yeah.
Time and Time Again. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So yeah, if that kind of stuff is what y'all are into, definitely go and check that out because it's just a lot of fun. And one of the things that he gets moved around for is to keep the moon from getting blowed up. So, it's just kind of like this is the kind of stuff you're dealing with here, right? It's just a load of fun, man. It's just a load of fun. Even if you're not into like the Legion of Superheroes or whatever like that, there's a lot of stuff in here that you'll enjoy. Or if you're not familiar with the Legion of Superheroes, this is actually a really good story to read to get acquainted with them. Yeah, I would recommend this to somebody for that purpose, definitely.
You know what's funny?
I just remembered.
I think this is the Legion from the Pocket Universe, wasn't it?
I think so.
I don't know. I thought it was like
this is 1991. They haven't rebooted yet.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it would be
no reboot,
like
Right? This is still Pocket Universe Legion. That's funny.
But yeah, because he meets the 5 years later Legion, doesn't he? Which is really cool to see Superman interacting with the 5 years later Legion.
Mhm.
And something I remembered while Lamar was talking as well, you saying how fun it was. This storyline features Superman singing "Everybody Walk the Dinosaur" to a dinosaur, which is great.
Look, I left that for you because I wanted you to be the one to say that. That's why I didn't.
I will say Superman is all over the place, all over time, all over space in this particular storyline. And I think it's a testament to how great he works when you plant him in these things. Especially, I think it's, we can say that it's because he was created during the Great Depression. Superman works great in World War II.
Yes.
Yeah,
he works great in World War II stories.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, that when he goes to the ghetto, doesn't he? And proves he's more powerful than a locomotive, basically. I won't say any more than that, but it's so good.
The other thing is you guys kept talking about the Legion. Can I also just plug that time and time again has an appearance by everyone's favorite rhyming demon, the demon Etrigan.
Yep. Of course, he goes to blimmin' Camelot. I'd forgotten that. This story's got blimmin' everything.
He's got him in everything. And I do love the demon Etrigan.
And another thing to sell people on this storyline is that the way Superman gets bounced in time is he has to find an explosion, basically. So it's like Quantum Leap with explosions.
Quantum Leap is a great vehicle for these things. The Flash, Jeremy Adams' Flash just did it like a couple years ago, right? So again, I'm not covering every storyline. I'm just going to what I think are the important beats. So let me know if you think I'm missing an important beat, and then we'll go back to it. In July of 1991, around halfway through what's covered in this omnibus, they launched a fourth Superman title called Superman the Man of Steel by Louise Simonson and John Bogdanov, who apparently loves Superman so much that he named his son Kal-El and turned down the job of drawing Superman for like several times until he was finally convinced to take on this title. That particular storyline reintroduced the Eradicator. So the Eradicator originated from the Superman story Exile, which we mentioned earlier.
The Eradicator is the whole reason why Jor-El didn't just build a huge rocket and get all the Kryptonians off Krypton, because this device that was created in Krypton's ancient past, which resembles the rocket that brought Superman to Earth, but it's about this big, and this powerful artifact genetically tied all Kryptonians except Kal-El to the planet, so they couldn't leave the planet or they'd die. And it was just, it's like a Nazi machine in a way, a eugenics machine, just like a powerful device to keep Krypton pure. Superman ends up with it in the Exile storyline and sort of keeps it on his shelf, as you do. And
as you do with dangerous devices.
Yeah, and as Duy said earlier on in Day of the Krypton Man, which is a fantastic story, it gradually takes over his mind to make him a pure Kryptonian. And so he throws it into the sun in the end, which is as you do. And then in the omnibus, it forms a body for itself in the sun. So it's not like an ornament anymore, an artifact. It's like it's a thing. It's with arms and legs.
Yeah, it becomes the Krypton Man.
Yeah.
Essentially. So I think at the time I was surprised at how much this creative team kept going back to the Eradicator. Like, did anyone else feel this? Like, every time the Eradicator showed up, I'm like, really? It's the Eradicator again? And then, as we know, eventually he would become such a key part in the Death and Return of Superman that I was like, really? It's the Eradicator again? But it works, though. I'm just surprised that they kept on going back to the Eradicator.
Yeah, it's like Krypton's shameful past embodied in one character, isn't it? You know, it's like Superman's so great fighting Nazis, and this is Krypton Nazis, but embodied in this one character. And so I'm not surprised they kept going back to that well, because it's such a rich one. But then, of course, I think that character's never lived up to his promise after the return of Superman. Mm-hmm. You know, that was the kind of the pinnacle of that character, I think.
I don't know, because I think that they were trying to make the Eradicator some sort of anti-hero. And I think by the very nature of the Eradicator, who is, you know, a Nazified artificial intelligence, there's no way. Like, his ultimate destiny is to be a bad guy.
Yeah.
Also, I think I talk about this a lot. Like, I talk about sometimes the role that you have is just overtaken by something else that's better. And I think the moment the cyborg Superman comes in, like, that's your technology gone bad character.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, Lamar, what do you think of the them launching this new series, Man of Steel, with the Eradicator? And
like, for me, it's kind of like what you guys were talking about just now. You know, I think the reason why the Eradicator works in that capacity is because he's such a departure. Kind of like what we were talking about, how Clark is the real person.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Eradicator is like if Superman was the real person in this particular, and like in the post-crisis universe, the way the Kryptonians are set up. If Superman was the real person and not Clark, this is what you would get, right? In a lot of ways, because of what Paulie just ran through. Because, you know, Kryptonians were seen to be something different. They weren't just like some people on a planet somewhere that look like people, look like human beings, but they have all these powers. Like, it was a little more to it than that, you know. And John Byrne kind of started it, but then they just kind of took it someplace else, like to, you know, like what Paulie was talking about with, you know, him basically being the result of their version of eugenics and stuff like that. And, you know, if that was who Superman actually was and Clark was the act, you know, you don't have Superman anymore. Like, you have the Eradicator. So the Eradicator wouldn't exist in a world where Superman was the real guy, right? So it's just interesting to think about, and just his character and stuff. Like, I enjoyed reading it because, you know, so it's kind of like, do you want to know where the consequences are for Superman actually being like this? This is what the consequences are, you know? So you can actually see it played out in the story. And even more so, like, later, you know, when they do the thing after Superman dies and he comes back and everything. And when he appears in that, you know, and, you know, and they're like, well, I mean, when I was reading it, I was like, that's not Superman, that's the Eradicator. Like, it was just so plain to see, right? Like, I know who that is. Like, you know, John Henry, I didn't know who he was or whatever, but this guy, yeah, I know who that is. Like, I'm not even, you know, but I do think that that story, and like, that story in its own way is fun, even though you know, like the material is kind of heady, you know, it still manages to be a fun story. And I think that, you know, the Eradicator, like Dewey said, you know, it's like it doesn't work as an anti-hero, right? I mean, you know, his name is the Eradicator. Like like
You
there's
know
a
who he
certain,
is.
you
Yeah.
know, yeah, it's like you can't reform a person who eradicates things and that's what they do. Like they literally wear that on their chest, right, so to speak. So it's like there's nowhere to go, but you know, you can't go up from that. So I just think embracing him as a guy who's, you know, and having him like be, you keep running into uh like Clark keeps having to deal with certain things about his Kryptonian heritage that kind of set him apart from other people, but also his human upbringing that sets him apart from the Kryptonians that have come before him. You know, just having him around for that actually is really, really cool because you actually get to see both sides of it, right? And it just kind of seems just like as a side on a side tip, it seems like for the most part, all of these remnants you get of these Kryptonians and stuff, it's like they always are like coming here trying to do bad things. Like outside of like the people that are related to Superman, like, you know, his cousin and everything. But like all of these other like beings that come from Krypton, they bring destruction with them when they come. You know, it's like so.
It's true.
Yeah, you know, but the way they handle it, there's no overlap. Like Eradicator is different from Zod and Ursa and Non. They're different from uh who was the guy?
Jaxor,
Yeah. You know,
who is
or
really just Zod.
yeah, basically. You know what I mean? Like it's like they're all kind of different, you know, and that I just think that's kind of cool. So there's all these different dimensions even to that, and the way that they handle it, you know, is interesting. But yeah, but this story here is just, it was a lot of fun. You know, I would just remember it being a lot of fun.
Good stuff. Like the Eradicator ended up being one of his top villains, and also ended up being the guy who saved his life. I guess the next big story beat that happens, I'm not sure if there is a big story beat that happens in between this one and the next one, because a lot of it is kind of holding in place to see what's going to happen with Lex's with Lex's estate, and Superman keeps trying to investigate it. They really like held that out, right? But I suppose the next big story beat that happens is Superman and Lois go up to a mountain to talk.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure we have a lot to say about that, because I think it was more a thing where they finally had to talk about the fact that he's Superman.
It's a lovely issue.
It's a lovely issue, yes.
Yeah.
It's a good, really good issue.
And it pays off later, because they make a big deal in that issue about how that's right. They feel like they have loads of time up on that mountain talking, and you find out it's because one of the linear men gifted that time to them, which I think is really nice.
It's nice. And like way later on, when they take a break, they go back to this mountain to talk. So that's way later on. I just want to point out that comic is by Dan Jurgens and Brett Breeding. I think for all of his reputation as being the big money shot guy, Dan Jurgens is responsible for a lot of the quieter stories in Superman history. And that is one of them. Actually, this omnibus will end on another one of them. Right after that, I think this is the resolution of a really long-running storyline. Superman finally takes down Intergang.
Yes.
Due to an expose by both Lois and information given by Cat Grant. Cat Grant. You know what? Now that I brought up Cat Grant, we were talking about the supporting cast earlier. Like, Cat Grant isn't even like on the top level of the supporting cast, and I'm invested in Cat Grant, right? Like, reading
absolutely.
this. Yeah, go on. Talk to me about it.
Well, so Cat Grant is like this gossip columnist. I think she was originally brought in um, as a sort of other potential love rival for Lois. So not even a love rival, but just another potential love interest for Clark, just to explore that.
Yeah,
Um,
just somebody who's interested in Clark, just
yeah,
to
I
add
don't think her and
spice.
Lois were ever pitted against each other as rivals, which is good, I think.
Because Clark was
It-
never interested in her.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Um, so yeah, she was like the gossip columnist, and then she went on to like you find out that she had hidden depths. Like when her ex-husband was a gangster, and she had a son called Adam with him. So you find out that, you know, rather than being this sort of ditzy, shallow airhead, you know, she's this single mom who's really devoted to her child. And also she's integral in taking down Intergang. And she does this by getting really close to Morgan Edge, doesn't she?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
just basically entering into a relationship with Morgan Edge, but it's because she wants to take down Intergang. And Morgan Edge has got connections with Intergang,
And he
and
also
she
has
uses this.
connections to Darkseid.
Yes. So she's someone who takes journalism really seriously as well. So you're kind of following this character who initially seems again like this ditzy airhead, but actually has got these depths. And obviously the way she's going about her investigative journalism is quite morally grey as well.
Yes.
You know, she's essentially sleeping with Morgan Edge to get this information. So, you've got that extra layer to it as well, that it's a bit dodgy what she's doing, But at the same time, she's risking her life as well doing this.
Yeah, and she
So,
also gets inappropriately hit on by Morgan Edge's dad.
yeah,
Mhm.
who's horrible.
Who's
He's a horrible
horrible.
man. He's a great character, but a horrible man. Yeah.
Like Cat Grant ends up working as well for the rival of the Daily Planet. And that dude, who eventually ended up being Satanist. but that dude, like, even I was interested in, like, that's how deep the bench for the
Yeah.
supporting cast was, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Intergang. Like, I don't know about you, Lamar, I don't know what you thought of this, but like I always thought it was weird that Superman couldn't really take on, like, couldn't really just shut down the street level gang. But turns out they have connections to Darkseid.
Mm-hmm.
So is that enough of an equalizer?
Yeah, that's actually that's actually kind of wild, and even if you go back, and look at like the history of Intergang, um, and I think it's in the pre-crisis era, they established that Intergang was put together back in the 20s, and that Morgan Edge was the guy who like brought it back after it fell apart, right? So I just think that's kind of interesting. And just to be like, yeah, so Intergang got ties to has ties to Darkseid. And it's like, wow, if you're gonna level up, that's how you do it, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah. And didn't Intergang, didn't they tried to murk Cat Grant, right? Didn't they? And she had to get like bodyguards and stuff, right? If I'm remembering that right.
She had to
She got
get
gangbuster.
a
Yeah,
bodyguard.
there you go. Right. Gangbuster. Yeah.
The best one on the market, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm that one dude who loves Gangbuster.
He is great.
I mean, shoot. I mean, the guy hops off the building dressed up like a football player from the future, and he pulls out a pair of nunchucks.
He uses it as a belt.
And he uses it as a belt, and it looks like it's made from like PVC pipe or something like that. But hey, he's doing his thing, But
I do want to point out that I do think it is Dark Knight over Metropolis, where Batman. No, I don't. It is not Dark Knight over Metropolis, but there is one storyline where Batman, Superman, and Gangbuster all team up to save Cat Grant, and Cat Grant says Gangbuster is the best out of all three of them.
There we go.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Vindication. Anyone? Yeah. So much like I know a lot of people complain about crossovers now and how they derail stories, and I complain about them too. But this was a relatively new thing in 1991. So most of these stories take place in 1991. There were two stories at the time, two crossovers, DC crossovers at the time. One was called War of the Gods, which did not have a tie-in in these books to my recollection. But the other one was called Armageddon 2001, which did all the time, just every single book. So for those of you guys who are reading this, who are watching this and who will be reading this omnibus for the first time, just keep in mind that there was an event called Armageddon 2001 where a dude named Wave Rider just shows up and inappropriately touches people so that he can look into their futures. Possible futures. And since Superman had 4 books, I don't know if they did it for every book. He touched Superman several times.
Yeah, they had to justify, didn't they? Because the whole thing, he was like touching them to look into their future. But of course, if a character had more than one book, Wave Rider had to touch them several times and see several different futures. So it was like you had Wave Rider going, "Oh, I'd better check again on this one."
He has more depth than I thought. I might have missed
I only
something.
need to check once, you know?
Yeah.
Superman, I got to check 4 times.
He's ridiculous. Armageddon 2001 was an interesting crossover in terms of its mechanics, because it seemed like every book could participate without ever actually affecting the books, because every story was taking place in a possible future, which interesting exercise. But if you're reading this omnibus, I feel like those issues where Armageddon 2001 comes in, you know, they're just gonna derail you. So just know that going in, I think.
Does it have the annuals in the omnibus? Do you know?
Does it have the annuals in the omnibus? It does not have the annuals
that's
in
a
the
shame.
omnibus.
They're
man.
great. I love those annuals.
Nah, those annuals will fly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is a couple of issues. There's at least one issue of Action Comics, which is 670.
Yeah.
Where they clean up after Armageddon.
Yeah.
So there is that, and it's just like, you know, so you're reading this omnibus, and all of a sudden there is a story where they're cleaning up after a story that you're not reading in this book.
Yes.
But having said that, you know what? That happens in virtually every comic book now. So
yeah,
this is nothing.
Yeah. Occupational hazard. Yeah.
That's an occupational hazard at this point. Also want to talk about The Adventures of Superman number 482, which has the Parasite in it, which is, the cover is a recreation of that famous Neil Adams cover where the Parasite is punching Superman. It is by Jerry Ordway. It is interesting to me because this is where the Parasite turns purple. So in the first appearance of the Parasite post-crisis, he's fighting Firestorm.
I love the Parasite. I think he's a good villain. And what they go on to do with the Parasite in the Triangle era, but much later in the Triangle era, is super interesting, I think. And they kind of abandoned that, which is a shame. But I think he's a great character. And this is the one where they just changed his name from Maxwell Jensen to Rudy Jones.
Yeah.
And I don't know why they did that, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really make any difference.
I've always thought the Parasite was a great foil for Superman, because Superman is a physical character and he can't come anywhere near the Parasite.
Yeah.
But I have also thought that due to the fact that the Parasite doesn't really care about anything other than eating Superman, uh, he is a little underserved as a villain. Lamar, thoughts on the Parasite?
No, I agree. I think, visually, he's great, for a character like Superman. Because, obviously you get the big, like when he touches Superman and he drains his power and stuff, there's a lot of visual stuff that happens that's cool. Like I think now doesn't he have like the mouth like the lampreys, the fish that have that round mouth and they hatch onto yeah, so it's just stuff like that. I think that is interesting. And the other thing too is that like his power, like just on his own, he's just a big purple guy, right? And it's like Superman punches purple people all the time. It's not that big of a deal. But then when the mouth come out, then it's something else, right? So I just think that, there's because like you said, Superman can't touch him, when it comes to that, because he can drain his powers by touching him. So it's like, okay, I've neutralized a part of your power set. Now, how are you going to deal with me? Right. And just like you said, the fixation on, I just want to, chomp on Superman, that's kind of wild, to me. But, but I kind of look at him though, is like, even though he could be really, really dangerous, I just think he's a fun character to have around, because there's other types of stories you can tell with him that aren't like the earth-shattering stories, so and a lot of the Parasite stories, revolve around not just how Superman defeats the Parasite this particular time, because he seems to keep getting all of these other like hiccups with his powers.
Yeah.
With like the last thing Superman did ain't gonna work this time because now I can do this. And so what ends up happening is his stories end up being about how Superman treats other people, like while he's being Superman. And I think that's a big part of what makes him work as a character, as a superhero, so, and he even extends that to the villains that he interacts with. I mean, because technically speaking, if every time the Parasite comes around, he could just kind of, jump at him or something and the mouth come out, and then he could just blow him away and, send him flying over the horizon if he wanted to, but he doesn't do that. Like, he's understand, like, yeah, Rudy, you got a lot of problems, bro. So I'm not gonna do that. We just gonna do it like this, and then we're gonna try to get you some help. And Rudy just always be like, nah, I just want to eat Superman. I don't want help. You know what I'm saying? So he's really like self-destructive, like as a part of,
Basically, yes.
That's the thing about Parasite, though, in terms of this omnibus, all that interesting stuff you're describing doesn't really come until way past this omnibus. It's still in the Triangle era, but after Superman's death. Like the lamprey mouth doesn't come until after Superman's death, when Superman, after he comes back from the dead, he can't stop absorbing sunlight. So he just becomes this really sort of muscular, monstrous Superman.
My God, that was a weird story.
Yeah, and Parasite drains all it, like more power than he ever has before from this monstrous Superman, and that's when he gets the lamprey mouth. And then after that time, they started drawing Parasite differently. They started drawing him as this sort of bloated leech or bloated tick who's gorged on blood, And they were never really drawing him like that before. And around that time, then he started absorbing the minds of the people he drained. He got a scientist in his brain saying, Rudy, you shouldn't just be trying to eat Superman. You should be trying to take over the world and stuff as well. And there was a bit more to him. So sadly, during this omnibus, he's still kind of boring Parasite, which is a shame.
Yeah, there's a couple of characters in Superman's Rogues Gallery where you can kind of tell they were created specifically to give Superman a threat more than actually being characters on their own. The other one is Metallo.
Yes. Yeah.
I prefer the Parasite because Metallo's just like, I mean, I get it. We need to have Kryptonite in the story. It's easy. Okay, so we're getting to the last multi-part story in the omnibus, But that means I want to go back to immediately after the Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite, where we are introduced to a small-time immortal named Mr. Z.
Mhm.
So Mr. Z has a little crystal where he can put people in. And then at the very end of this omnibus, there is a story called Blackout, where Mr. Z takes control of Superman for a little bit. And then due to random events, they both end up with amnesia on an island. And I think it is one of the funniest series of comics I have ever read. Superman ends up kind of having to marry this islander woman, and then Lois to finds him and to snap him out of it, just like makes out with him. And the Guardian is like, Miss Lane, aren't you married? What will Mr. Kent think of this? And then Superman and Mr. Z end up becoming friends because they don't actually know each other at this point. And then at the very end, everybody leaves the island except for Mr. Z. Hopefully he's still happy over there. What do you guys think?
I love this story. It's really funny, but it is weird how like Mr. Z
really weird.
It's
so
Mr.
weird.
Z is really evil, right? Mr. Z is an immortal Nazi wizard, right? Who steals the soul of people and keeps them in the crystal. He's a war criminal. He took part in the Holocaust, right? He's super evil. And he gets this like twee little happy ending on an island where he forgets who he is and just like really loves living on the island. And doesn't he end up with that islander woman or something?
I don't think he does, but I could be remembering this
but,
wrong.
But he's happy on this. He even gets like
he's definitely into the islander woman.
Yeah, that's right. And he gets a little hat like Gilligan from Gilligan's Island, doesn't he?
There is a reference. I remember this. There is a reference to Gilligan's Island.
Yeah, the boat is there, isn't it?
The boat. Yeah, the boat from Gilligan's Island is in that story.
Yeah, and he gets Gilligan's hat and puts it. And he's just this Nazi just gets this idyllic tropical island ending. Like so it's very strange, but I'm not saying it's bad because it is a really funny story.
It's funny. I don't expect. It's not that the Triangle era doesn't have comedic moments, right? But I didn't expect the whole story to be funny, especially with this premise. Omar, do you remember the story? Blackout.
Oh yeah. The Mr. Z joint. And I'm gonna tell you something. The first time I saw that cover, right, with him and he's got Superman encased in the jewel on top of the staff. I was, and I remember reading that and I was like, what is Alfred doing to Superman? And like, why is he got him in that jewel? And how did he do it?
It's so stupid.
And so I'm thinking the whole time, this is Alfred. And then so I'm like, but I gotta figure this out. And then I get into it. And imagine me thinking this is Alfred now. And I'm reading this. And then we get all of the other stuff that Mr. Z is, right? And so I was like, oh my God, this is like better than
So what is this?
It's like, yo. And the funny thing about it too, like when I was talking about Superman meeting up with the JSA, right? In this story, for those who haven't read it, Superman's about to actually encounter during the time hop. He's about to encounter, they're called the Justice Battalion because they're actually fighting in the war as soldiers. So, the Linear Man comes and he's like, yeah, man, this ain't the time for this right here. But we got something else you can handle. So I'm going to send you over here. And he encounters this guy, right? And so, but this is like, of course, when he was younger, because this is during the war and everything. But it's just like from there and then having this guy pop up because he's like a hypnotist or something, right? Like that's like part of it. It's been a while since I read
He's
this.
got mind control abilities.
Yeah, so it's like mind control. Okay. Like, is this story so wild that Germany actually perfecting the technology for the atomic bomb is like, that's like nowhere in the story, but that's actually what happens. But it doesn't even rate as the wildest thing that happens.
No.
Yeah, this one just, it kind of caught me off guard, and but in the best way possible, right? So, for me, like, it's been a while since I read it, but I think I'm gonna go back and read it again, because every time I read it, I'm just like, this is just, they don't make this kind of nonsense no more, right?
Great way to read it again, because for those of you watching, because the Superman Triangle Era, the Triangle Era Omnibus is out on September 17th, 2024. Volume 1. We are down to the very end, and there's one more story I want to spotlight before we get to the very last issue of this, which is Superman has a team up with everyone's favorite King of the Seas, Aquaman.
Yay.
The reason that they're teaming up is because we are now establishing post-crisis that Superman, much like his pre-crisis counterpart, his first girlfriend was a mermaid named Lori Lemaris. And he thought that Lori Lemaris had died, but really, the ending of this particular issue will show that Lori Lemaris lives. And Lori Lemaris is a mind reader and a mermaid and knows that Superman's going to go off, marry somebody else. But what makes it a little funny for me is that Clark still clearly, fondly remembers Lori, the mermaid, as he is engaged to Lois Lane. Is Lori Lemaris? I think a case could be made for the idea that Lori Lemaris was not necessary in the post-crisis universe. What do you guys think?
Well, I'm surprised that she survived, but I'm glad she did. I love that. It's just a really Superman thing, isn't it? Like, his college girlfriend was a mermaid. It's like it's like Grant Morrison says, Superman goes through the same things that we do, but elevated in some way into some fantastic place. So we all have like girls we go out with in college. Well, I didn't. I was on my own. But not all people have college girlfriends, and then they lose touch with them, and they think fondly back of what could have been, and Superman's just happens to be a mermaid, and I'm amazed they kept that, because I'm so glad they did, though.
I am too. Yeah. Lamar, I know you love this.
Oh man, who don't? What's not to love, bro? Like, for me, like, when and this is actually kind of, I guess, how stuff just kind of works. But there was when they did the crisis, and then they were trying to Marvelize everything, and they got rid of a lot of this stuff, but you slowly start to see it come back.
Yes.
And some of it starts to happen almost immediately, relatively speaking. I mean, things move faster now, but back then, introducing her within like 5 years was actually pretty quick, right? So, it's just like, you think about it, like, this is Superman, and let's say that Superman's talking to somebody, and let's say he just saved somebody off of a building or something. He's like, hey, listen, I'm gonna take you home, but I gotta go by my people house real quick, so it's on the way. And you go there with him, and you go in through the balcony door or whatever, and it's a mermaid in there, sitting in there, at a desk on a computer in a tub of water. Like that's like a Superman thing. Like it's not absurd at all, right? It really isn't. Even though people think it is, it's not absurd. So it's just something that's fun, right? And just the idea is like, oh, well, how did two of y'all meet? Oh, we was together in college. my college years, my my early 20s and stuff, my late teens. This is what I was into.
I have so many questions.
But it's great. It's just great. And those stories, that the actual story that they tell in the pre-crisis continuity, where they introduce her as a character, it's a great story. Like, it holds up now. And just the fact that they went from that to is like this soap opera story, which is funny because during the time she debuts, like romance comics were like really, really big.
Yeah.
And so, from that to him having like a Days of Our Lives episode with a mermaid, and now she's just kind of like a remnant of that era, but it's fun. It's great. Like, what's not to love about it?
I love this particular issue because Aquaman gives her like this gigantic money shot. It's like, he must never know, splash page, that Lori Lemaris lives. Yeah. By the way, nobody ever mentions Aquaman's mullet. Everybody keeps talking about Superman's mullet. Nobody ever mentions Aquaman's gigantic mullet in this era.
That's good. That's because Aquaman could pull it off.
Okay, Paul. I want to talk about, because we brought up Lori Lemaris, I want to talk about, we've been talking about the supporting cast for this era of Superman, and I want to talk about the one character I do think was not served well by this era of Superman. You all know who I'm going to mention, and it is Lana Lang, who in pre-crisis was Lois's rival. Like, actually Lois's rival, because she dated Superboy in high school. There is no Superboy here. John Byrne established that Clark never really had any feelings for her. And she spends pretty much the entire era of post-crisis mooning over Superman, hating the fact that he's with Lois, hating the fact that he's engaged to Lois, until she finally, let's just call a spade, settles for Pete Ross. And I'm looking at this and what we just talked about, and the whole thing, the whole first love thing is taken away from her by Lori Lemaris. The whole Lois's rival thing is taken away from her, kind of, by Cat Grant. Like, there's nothing here for Lana Lang. The most memorable thing that happens to her post-crisis is she gets beaten up in Superman #2 because in the same issue where Amanda McCoy finds out that Clark Kent is Superman. What do you guys think of this, being pre-crisis Superman fans and also big fans of the Triangle era? Because I am a little confused as to why everyone else turned out well in this era, except for who probably is his, like, at this point, his third or fourth most iconic supporting character.
Well, she was a huge character just before Crisis as well. Like, people forget her huge role that Crisis wiped out, because in the early 80s, before the Crisis, Clark Kent was dating Lana Lang, and Lois, wasn't really, I mean, she was still in the books, but she wasn't in the picture as the love interest really anymore, because Clark and Lana were dating. And because Lana was Clark's co-host, co-anchor when they presented the news together. So she had this huge role. And then, like you say, as soon as the Crisis happened, then she was like, everything she did was defined by Clark, She was the one that, to show that the Eradicator was taking over Clark's mind, he was horrible to Lana. It was, she was always serving that kind of purpose throughout the whole run. And you're right, yeah. And no matter how they spun it, it did just seem, because they'd established this pining for Clark as her defining feature, there was no way that it wasn't going to seem like settling when she got together with Pete Ross. which was a shame, really, because it did a disservice to both those characters. So I don't really know what they could have done with her after Byrne established that Lana was this sort of, because Byrne established that she followed Clark around the world for 10 years, taking pictures of him secretly. And I don't know how a character comes back from that, like,
From being a stalker.
Yeah. And
Right.
of course, she was an agent of the Manhunters as well, but nobody really mentions that.
Yeah. I mean, the damage has already been done. There's no need to kind of shellac on.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I just Lamar, any
But how
thoughts
do you come
on?
back from that? The damage is done,
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, and that's kind of the highlight of what we're talking about here is she's like been treated a lot like Paulie, you actually just said it perfect. Her defining trait as a character over these years has been that she's been in love with Superman her whole life. And so much so that in a run I think it was Action Comics, when Ivan Reis was doing Action Comics, him and Mark Campos, when they were doing the art. But she was watching over him, while he was recovering from some stuff he got into, and he didn't have his powers and stuff. So he was on the mend, and she was watching after him and stuff. And she's actually sitting there watching him, and he's sleeping, and then she tries to kiss him and stuff while he's asleep. So it's like they keep putting her in these crazy predicaments and stuff, and it gets to the point, it's like, what kind of rewrite could you do to strengthen that character, or to actually make her a character instead of a plot device? Because when she married Pete Ross and he was the vice president with Lex Luthor, she was just kind of a prop in that, you know what I mean? And it's just, she's just been in a weird place for so long. I think somebody should just figure out at this point, it's like, man, if y'all not gonna do right by it, just don't use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was done. Go ahead, bro.
Well, I was just saying that what you were saying about that storyline where she was watching over Clark and being really creepy and kissing him against his will. That's during Chuck Austin's Action Comics run, which was in the early 2000s. So after the Triangle era. But Chuck Austin gets a lot of stick for that online, amongst many other things.
Yeah, as he should.
Yeah, but I don't have a problem with what he did with Lana there, because, like I said, the damage to Lana was already done.
It's right.
All
line.
he was doing, all he was doing was leaning into that damage.
Yeah,
and which I think is valid, because that her being this weird, creepy character who pines after Clark, that's already been done, and it's not something I like for the character, but it's been done. So
it is the character at that point.
Yeah, it's the character at that point, and Chuck Austin just leaned into it and went the whole hog with it, and it's like that's as valid a take as the next one of what to do with Lana, and it didn't work, but I've got no objection to Chuck Austin trying it, because you might as well at that point,
I mean, it's kind of like, how long, it's like you said, like she'd been on that road for so long, that's all people really know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. And
it didn't work because at that point, Lana hasn't worked.
Yeah.
Right. And it's weird to me because, Smallville, the TV show, really tried to rehabilitate Lana. And Lana was just in Superman 3.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, she was coming off that lick. Yeah.
She was coming off of that. So I don't know what they could have done with this character at this point, but we'll get back to other supporting characters eventually. I do want to talk about what I think they're going to end the omnibus on, which is, and I hope this is the issue they end the omnibus on, because I think it's perfect. Superman number 64, which is called the Metropolis Mailbag. This issue, Superman once a year, every Christmas, will go read all of his fan mail. Most of them are just asking for help or asking him to endorse something or whatever. And that's it. That's the issue. Paul, I'm going to ask you what you think of this because I know it is done by your favorite, Dan Jurgens.
Yes, Dan Jurgens. Yeah, again, an example of one of these quiet issues that Dan Jurgens can do so well, even though he's not, like you say, he's not associated with that. And yeah, it's just really nice that I think when Superman tries to help everyone in this way by, in this case, by answering Christmas letters, essentially, it's kind of hammers home that even though he's Superman, he can't help everyone, and he does have limits, and he's not a genie for the world, and he can't solve the world's problems. And so when he goes around individually trying to solve each person's individual problems, the fact that he's only doing it once a year at Christmas because it's Christmas shows that he can't function like that all the time, and it delves into the limitations of Superman. And I think I always think that's a really interesting thing to explore. If Superman had his way, he would be able to help everyone individually on the planet, but he physically can't. Not even he can do that.
And even in the story, it just so happens that somebody had just died with a well-functioning heart, and somebody needs a heart transplant. I think it's the heart. It might be some other. It might be some other vital organ. Lamar, you have fond memories of this particular issue? This is one of those. By the way, this is one of those issues that works great as a single issue, and I don't think it'll read as powerfully as when you're reading it in an omnibus or in a trade, because it works perfectly when you're holding it in your hand as a single one and done issue.
Anyway, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was actually about to say that, because just as a one-off story, it's great. I think if it's in the omnibus, it'll work if it's the very last thing they put in there. And you understand it's separate from everything else. But I love that story. And just because for all the stuff that you guys were just talking about. And the funny thing though is that, and this is part of like why I love that story so much, is that Superman's doing all of this stuff like during Christmas time and everything. But in DC, Santa Claus is a real character. Like, he exists in the DC universe.
Superman has met him.
And Superman has met him, right? And there's certain stories where like people would say like Santa Claus ain't real, and he would just be like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Santa Claus ain't real. And it was just because he had just grew up all his life accepting the fact that Santa Claus was a real person even before he met him, so and Santa Claus, actually, for those who not familiar with what I'm talking about, Santa Claus actually every single year, obviously Darkseid gets coal for Christmas. So Santa Claus literally goes to Apocalypse, gets past, he runs through all of his guards just to get to Darkseid. He decimates everybody on Apocalypse, gets to Darkseid, drops him off the coal, and then dips every single year. And he's one of the biggest banes of Darkseid's existence, because Santa Claus is extremely powerful in DC Comics. Like, so just keep that in mind while we're talking about this story where he's doing this stuff at Christmas and answering these letters, just as kind of a background. But yeah, I think that's the kind of story that Superman is the character for. That I think even more so than anybody,
I agree.
And there's other characters you could compare him with. Like Captain America, for example. I don't think a story like this would work the same with Captain America.
No.
Like, Superman is definitely the character for this.
You can write a bunch of letters to Captain America, but you already know he can't do everything. There is an expectation with Superman that he can.
Right. Cap did have a hotline though, didn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, he ran a hotline with people who answered it for him. Yes, that's true.
But yes, Superman is the guy, and this story is one of the best stories to kind of illustrate again, Superman's interactions with a lot of cases just everyday people and stuff like that. And I think that Superman's at his best when you deal with him this way, so which is why I push back so much against this argument that Superman's not relatable. I mean, like, if somebody could literally swoop down out the sky and solve all your problems, you can't relate to that. Like, I don't understand. But, but especially when he's dealing with children, and just all of the Superman stories where he deals with children, like, I love them,
I think when people say Superman isn't relatable, a lot of it has to do with the fact that he is a very powerful person, but he chooses to do good, which fair, a lot of very powerful people will choose to not do good.
Absolutely.
But if you can't relate to that, maybe we should be doing some introspection.
Yeah, because you might be one of the folk that's doing the bad stuff with the power, So that might be your MO, whether you want to admit it or not. But yeah, this story, I think is fantastic. And it's one of my favorite Superman stories, period. Like, if I pick 10,
great,
this would be one of them. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's a great issue. I want to talk about, before we close this off, we're talking about the Volume 1 Superman Triangle Era Omnibus. There is a link in the description below. Which other stories or characters did we not cover that you would like to tell people about?
Oh, I'd be remiss to not mention Action Comics 664, where Superman runs into Kronos, and he ends up getting transported back into the time of the dinosaurs, and he spends the issue fighting dinosaurs. You know how we feel about dinosaurs, monkeys, and robots around here. You definitely got to check that out. Like, that's one off the rip that I can just think about. Superman fighting dinosaurs, like, because the cover is him inside the T-Rex mouth. So yeah, and it just goes up from there. So y'all definitely, we got to mention that.
That is a part of Time and Time Again, which is another reason why this is going to be, it's probably going to be the highlight of this whole omnibus.
Yeah.
Go on, Paul.
Well, for me, something we haven't covered is that I think, in fact, the cover of this omnibus is from an issue that goes into, like, Superman involving himself with world politics a bit, which I always find it's a really difficult thing, I think, for writers to do, but I always find it interesting when they give it a go. And the way they do it is just by making up Middle Eastern countries. America to have trouble with. So what is it? Kurak, isn't it? Kurak, yeah, made up a stand.
Gee, I wonder what Kurak is supposed to be.
So, but that's a really interesting issue. Again, Superman, how much can he get involved in world politics? And if you pick too much of that scab, then you dismantle Superman, I think. But it is interesting when writers do try and touch on it a bit, and they do in this run. So yeah, I like that. And I also want to talk a bit more about Louise Simonson and her work on Man of Steel. The way her run on that book, and you'll see it in these 8 issues that are in the omnibus. Just like, she touches on the forgotten people of Metropolis and the overlooked people of Metropolis a lot more than the other writers do, and that's really interesting. And obviously that will eventually lead into Steel and John Henry Irons.
That's true. That is true. That is true. I'm sad I missed that, actually, because that is the whole thing. That actually is what kicks off the death of Superman. Is that whole segment with that kid Keith?
Yes.
Right.
And of course, Keith eventually, way beyond this omnibus, but still in the Triangle era, ends up getting adopted by Perry White and his wife.
That's true.
Which sort of bookends the whole Jerry White, death of Jerry White sort of storyline,
Well, Jerry White was, it was no good anyway.
Yeah. But again, another example of how these storylines are earned, like Perry White adopting a son. That's earned because you followed Keith all the way through the Triangle era, and you followed Perry and his wife all the way through since the death of their son, and it culminates then in with him adopting Keith.
It's just really well organized. So shout out also to Superman Group editor Mike Harlan for keeping it all straight. There's a lot of moving pieces during the Triangle era. So
Yeah.
keeping it all straight, I cannot imagine was an easy job.
I can't remember the issue number. It might be the last issue, the Triangle Era in action, where Superman fights that the Helgramite dude, that he got hired because they was trying to kill the new Lex Luthor, right? Like the Lex Luthor 2.
Mhm.
And like also what happens in that story, because we talking about Bibbo and Jimmy. Bibbo actually gives some assistance to Jimmy, like on Thanksgiving. So it's like there's a Jimmy and a Bilbo story in there. But yeah, but no, that one just always kind of struck me as wild, because this dude, Helgranite, is it
Helgramite, yeah.
yeah, Helgramite, yeah, he's Helgramites are actual insects.
Mm.
Yeah, but that's literally his powers, is that he throws cocoons at people and they get caught in the cocoon and then they just become like his minions or whatever. But so it's kind of a wacky story. But yeah, nah, that was a good one. The cover is great though. The cover for
It
that
is great.
Yeah.
It is
Mhm.
the last action issue. I do think
It
that,
is. Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I hope it's not what they end with. I hope they end with Metropolis mailbag. But
Yeah.
let us go back to this, because at the very end of Blackout, we are introduced to Lex Luthor 2, who is supposed to be Lex Luthor's son from Australia. He's got an accent and everything. He is the Lex Luthor who will show up in the Death and Return of Superman. Did anybody not think this was Lex Luthor?
Well, I first saw him because I mentioned at the start that I got the Triangle Era in bits and pieces out of order. So I read Death of Superman. That was my first thing that I
Oh,
read.
so you
from the
already
Triangle
knew,
Era.
yeah.
Well, no, because they don't mention him being the original Lex Luthor in the actual Death of Superman story. They do in World Without Superman, but in
Okay.
the actual Death of Superman, the whole fight Superman has with Doomsday, they don't mention that Lex Luthor 2 is Lex Luthor. So I was just like, who's this guy? Oh, it's Lex Luthor's son. And I think it wasn't until I read World Without Superman, I was like, oh my God, it's actually Lex Luthor. Wow. So it was a reveal to me, at least,
When you found out, but you think if you had read it in order?
I don't know if I'd read it in order, maybe I would have figured it out, because yeah, there's shady stuff going on with him. You can tell that, can't you?
Yeah, because we were talking earlier about how when Lex 1 dies, he's not dead.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
then they do build up to the fact that, oh my God, he has a son that we've never heard about.
Yeah.
So, like,
Yeah.
Lamar, you knew, right?
Yeah, like I'm gonna tell you when I first was reading that, I thought that this might be like the 48 fake out, right? So I was like, okay, maybe this ain't it, right? And maybe this is just the one, because it was so on the nose, right? For me.
It's too
I was
obvious.
like,
Yeah,
it was too obvious to me. So I was like, okay, maybe they about to run an audible on us or something. But then by the time we got to the part where like Superman dies and he was buried and everything, and he goes down into Superman's tomb, and then he just starts smashing the casket, and he's like, and when Superman's like gone, right, like the body's gone,
yeah.
and so he was like, yeah, I knew you wasn't dead, because if you was gonna die, I was gonna be the one to kill you. And I was like, okay, so this is
Right.
him, right? So that was what sold it for me. But before that, I was kind of on the fence about it, because I was like, yeah, this is just way too obvious, right? And I was cool with it being obvious, right? Like,
I was cool with it being obvious. It's fine.
yeah. It didn't bother me at all, so I didn't feel put out by it. But I just reading the story and stuff, I was like, when I got to that part, I was like, yeah, I'm just waiting for him to get shot with a flamethrower or something, and all his hair burn off or something. You know what I mean? Like how is that reveal gonna happen? But yeah, that's kind of how I felt about it.
But what's lovely about Lex Luthor 2 is that the character that they claim is his mother, I can't remember the character's name, but she's a scientist who works for Luthor. they've already established during the Triangle era that she has a history with Luthor, and that she sort of disapproves of him but feels indebted to him, and has this, and she's a former lover of Luthor. So we already know that this character has a history with Luthor, and so it is plausible that she had a son with him.
Yes.
You know, it's completely plausible. I know everyone says this about the comics they read when they were 12, but I don't think we'll see the like of this kind of thing today. This level of coordination on a group of books, a group of monthly comics, this level of consistency on a group of monthly comics. And, you know, it went from like the mid 80s to the late 90s, you know, that's an incredible span of consistency and coordination. And it's amazing that they pulled it off. And I don't think we'll ever get that again. I don't think comics is built like that anymore. I don't think comics can do that slow burn stuff anymore, just because you're going to get cancelled mid slow burn if you try and do that, you know?
Well, the funny thing is, it feels like a slow burn.
Yeah.
But I think when you're binging it, it reads really fast.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, yes, I don't think you can do that in comics anymore, partly because the key to this thing is maintaining a schedule. And a lot of the time these days, you know, comics will be delayed because somebody's taking their time and stuff. Ahem, doomsday clock. But what ends up happening is that the moment something gets delayed, but the other books have to come out, so it cannot be that coordinated. I will push back a little bit though and say that we hadn't seen anything like that before. And even at the time, there were other books there were other franchises trying to be that level of coordinated, and they weren't. Batman wasn't that level of coordinated. Spider-Man wasn't that level of coordinated. The closest you could get is Age of Apocalypse era X-Men. And then the closest you could get after that is the weekly series 52.
Yes. Yeah. 52 is the closest we've got to it, I think, since then.
But even that had 4 writers working on all of the books, not one writer working on each book. And it had a consistent layout guy throughout in Keith Giffen. So this particular specific thing, I don't think has existed before. I don't think it existed during, and I don't think it can exist again.
No.
Yeah, I doubt it, because you got to remember, this was going on not just over 1 year, but a couple of years, you know, and to be able to have that consistency running between 4 books. And each one of these 4 books they have their own stuff that they're doing, right? Like outside of that. So to be able to do that, even like Dewey said, you know, it wasn't common at that particular time. It's probably impossible to pull off now. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with, you know, because even when you go from the 80s to the 90s like that, the stories weren't told the same, like just within that time period, right? And they still kept it together. Like, you try to do that today, and you're going to be looking at a story that's supposed to come out consecutive over 8-9 months. It's going to take you 3 years to get that story, you know? So it's just, you know, even though the world's a little smaller, you would think it would be easier, but actually it's not. It's more difficult now, you know?
Do you know what? Something just occurred to me. They did get close to it. Someone got close to it. And that's Spider-Man Brand New Day.
Oh, that is true.
Yeah. And it wasn't exactly the same, but it was pretty close. And it wasn't for as long. And it's got his people who don't like it. But I think that was a really solid run of Spidey comics.
That's an understatement.
Yeah, that is a big understatement. It was a great run of Spidey comics.
Well, the reason it's not the same is because the Triangle era had 4 titles, each with its own creative team, and that was coordinated. The coordination that was happening with Spider-Man Brand New Day was each arc was done by a specific creative team. So it's like you had a series of limited series.
Yeah.
And it is also a marvel, no pun intended. It is also a marvel in coordination, but I don't think it's as impressive.
No, it's not. It's the closest we've got apart from 52, but it's
Yeah.
nowhere near the achievement that the Triangle Era was. Yeah.
No. And shout out specifically again to Mike Carlin, but by his, in an interview that I have with him, which you can watch on the Comics Cube, he does talk about how Roger Stern was one of the guys who was really on top of things, making sure that everything was coordinated, basically saying, why haven't we addressed this? Hey, this thing happened, let's fix that. And I do think that's the kind of person you need when you're doing something like this.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was Superman, the Triangle Era. We're talking about the Omnibus, Volume 1, which is out on September 17, 2024. Go order it. I'm putting a link below on the Amazon link below, but support your local comic shops. And again, click like, share, subscribe, and we now have a Patreon. The link to that is below as well. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Lamar. It's a pleasure as always.